Everyone, I'm Emily with American Cultural Center Algiers, and you're watching Let's Chat. Happy International Women's Day to you all, a few days late, and happy Women's History Month. So in America, March is Women's History Month, which is when we celebrate the contributions women have made to history and to contemporary society. Later this month, we'll have on female pilots and a female executive at an American company based here in Algiers. Today, we have a journalist at a major U.S. publication, The Washington Post. I'm so excited to introduce you to our guest, Colby Itkowitz. Colby is a national politics reporter for The Washington Post. At The Washington Post, she's covered national politics, health policy. She was in charge of a blog called The Inspired Life, and she's written about the quirks of the federal government and campaigns. She was previously the Morning Call DC's correspondent. Prior to that, she covered Capitol Hill and transportation policy for Congressional Quarterly. Note, that is where I met Colby. So I have to disclose that Colby is one of my very, very best friends. And we met back in the day, as we say, when we were both reporters at Congressional Quarterly, covering Capitol Hill. But we have her as a guest today, not because she's my friend, but because she's an accomplished Washington, D.C. journalist. I asked Colby to share a short presentation about women journalists in honor of Women's History Month. She'll then talk more about her life and career, and you can ask Colby questions about Women's History Month and journalism in the YouTube chat. So just ask your questions there in the chat and we will relay them to Colby. Over to you, Colby.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. So I wanted to start with just a little bit about why it matters that we have women journalists in the first place. And long before women were even allowed to vote in America, there were female journalists covering politics like I do. And while it was mostly a male-dominated industry, there were several women that were able to break through as far back as the late 1700s. And I want to introduce you to some of the pioneers who paved the way for reporters like myself. But before I do, I just want to talk briefly about why it matters that there are women and other races and ethnicities represented in journalism. Etched on the wall inside the Washington Post is a quote that's attributed to one of our former publishers, and it's "Journalism is the first draft of history." It's incumbent upon journalists to record what is happening around them, to observe, ask questions, and to provide as many facts and background as possible to help people understand what's happening in their town, in their country, and in the world. Every journalist brings to the job their own unique perspective based on their lived experiences. And for a long time in America, journalism was a male-dominated industry made up of mostly white men who went to top schools. And what that meant was that for many, many decades, all the news was told through the eyes of the white male experience. Now, we've seen that change a lot in newsrooms as they begin to understand that a diversity of perspectives allows them to tell a bigger story, a better story. Women, minorities, based on where you grew up, so geography, class, all of those things inform how you're going to see a story and tell a story. And so I wanted to introduce you to some of the most famous female pioneers in journalism, and then we can talk a little bit more about how I got into journalism. So let me share that screen now with you. You'll have to excuse me because I do not have the technological savvy that Emily does.
Oh, looks good.
There we go. Okay. So Ida B. Wells was a slave in America and was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the emancipation that said that slaves were free and there couldn't be slavery anymore in America. She wrote about lynching in the American South. Now, lynching is something that was going on where Black people were being killed. They were being hung and beat. And a white mob actually burned her newspaper office and her printing press to try and silence her. But she moved to Chicago, which was freer than the South. And she continued to write about anti-segregation efforts, civil rights, women's rights. She is regarded as a pioneer in both women's journalism and African-American journalism. She, in fact, helped to found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which is the leading organization for African-American rights in America. And next we have from my own newspaper, Dorothy Butler Gilman. She was the first African-American female reporter at the Washington Post, and that wasn't until 1961. So in 1961, like I said in my opening remarks, the Washington Post and the rest of the country was mostly male dominated, and it was very racially segregated. But she came in to cover historic civil rights events that were happening in the 60s in America. And she made it a point to include Black voices in her coverage. And that kind of takes me to what I was saying in the beginning, that the reason why it's so important to have women and minorities as reporters is because they're going to seek out those voices, and they're going to give a voice to the people that might not be interviewed traditionally in a newspaper like the Washington Post. She co-founded an institution that works to improve media coverage by making sure that newsrooms reflect the communities that they serve. So you have, DC is famously a very, very diverse city, but to cover it, they didn't have anyone that looked like the people that lived here. And now we continue to struggle with this at the Washington Post and in newsrooms all around the country, but we work on it every day to make sure that races, ethnicities, classes are represented. Let's see. Okay, Nellie Bly. Now she's a really fun one to talk about. She was born in 1864 and was reassigned to the women's pages when she was working as a factory reporter at a newspaper. And she was just determined to be taken seriously. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you describe what the women's pages means? What did that mean?
Yeah, so sure, thanks, Em. So basically you're going to be covering things that they would think of were women's issues, society issues, fashion, not the serious issues like politics. You might be covering social parties and things of that nature, things that are cooking, things that they thought of as things that women would be interested in. But Nellie Bly said no, she wanted to cover really serious issues, things that were really going to make a difference. And one of the most famous things that she did was convincing her boss to let her go undercover in a mental asylum so that she could show the country the poor conditions of people that were put into these institutions, these hospitals for the mentally ill. And so she posed as someone who was mentally ill and was treated horribly, and got to then, write about, she has said that it almost made her go insane being there only for a short amount of time. And that's basically what she wrote about, was that you took these people that might be a little sick and putting them in these terrible situations actually made them sicker. And so she opened the country's eyes to the way we treat people with mental illness. Again, another topic for another time, but also a big issue in America is how we treat people with mental illness, something we still grapple with today. But Nellie Bly was one of the first people to really expose that. And then my personal favorite on the list is Helen Thomas. Now, Helen Thomas was a pioneer in Washington journalism. She worked as a White House reporter in the 1960s and earned herself the role of being the person who sat in the front row and got to ask the first question during White House press conferences. And she held that position through the presidency of George W. Bush in the early 2000s. She was the very first woman admitted to the Washington Press Club in 1975, which Emily can tell you we have been to many times. And so this was a place where women couldn't go. I mean, think about that. In 1975 was not that long ago. And she also became the first female president of the White House Correspondents Association, which is an association of reporters who cover the White House. And they kind of govern or make decisions around access and who gets to sit where in these press briefings. And a short little story is I was maybe in my early 20s and I had read Helen Thomas's book and I had written down, life goals, meet Helen Thomas, join the Washington Press Club. And I stuck it inside that book. Maybe a year or two later, I had an internship in Washington at a newspaper, and the internship came with a membership to the Washington Press Club. And I got to meet her at some dinner event there and take a picture with her. And so years later, I had found that book and I was flipping through it. And I realized that at 22, I achieved all my goals. I met Helen Thomas and I joined the Washington Press Club. So apparently that to me was like the pinnacle of what I could do in journalism. I would soon find out there was, what'd you say?
I said, done, wrap it up right there. You
done. I peaked. I peaked when I met Helen Thomas at the Washington Press Club, or the White House. Yeah, the Washington Press Club.
Amazing bucket list item.
I know I probably should have added a few more to the list since then, but so those are just four. There are so many, and I think one thing I was reading this morning actually is that we talk and we revere these women who paved the way for us, but we should also remember that there are women doing that work today, incredible women whose names might not be these marquee names. Sure, you've got television news reporters who Americans might think of as celebrities, but the ones that are actually working in local news, in political news, my colleagues at the Washington Post, their bylines around their stories, but they're not celebrities. But they're doing the hard work of exposing truth in America. So.
Thank you for that, Colby. I think that's a really good point. Oftentimes we think of, or maybe other people outside of the journalism profession, think of big names, big celebrities. When I was studying to be a journalist, everyone said, oh, you must want to be the next Barbara Walters. Barbara Walters was one of the most famous names in news. They said, oh, Barbara Walters. But I didn't necessarily want to be on TV. I wanted to be a newspaper reporter. And when I met women working at the newspaper in the community that I started working at a newspaper in Kalamazoo, Michigan, those were the women who really I was inspired by, because I just saw what they did every day and how badass they were.
Absolutely.
They were just so smart. And those are the women that I really admired more. So good point.
Absolutely the same.
Women aren't celebrities.
Right.
But we should know who they are nonetheless.
Yes, exactly.
Well, if you could kind of tell our audience how you got into journalism, what your career's been like. Did you always want to be a journalist ever since you were a kid?
Yeah, the decision was a little bit made for me. As a young child, I was 7 or 8, and a teacher had told my parents that I was a good writer and that I had a future in writing. And I loved compliments so much. I liked being praised. And so I thought, well, if that's what I'm good at, I guess that's what I'm going to do. I didn't know what that would look like. Did it mean I would write books? Would it mean I'd write speeches for politicians? And it was only until I was in high school, which is, when you're around 15 to 18 in America, that I joined the school newspaper, and just the bug hit me immediately. And I knew I had to be a reporter. And it was around that same time that George W. Bush was running to be president against a man named Al Gore, who was the vice president at the time for President Bill Clinton. And they were running against each other. And I was fascinated by that race. I read everything I could about it. I learned about the issues. I went to meetings to hear about how people were voting. And so around the same time that I caught the journalism bug, I also caught the politics bug. And I knew that I wanted those two things to go hand in hand. To me, there was nothing else that I wanted to cover than politics. I ended up covering a lot of things before and after, but that was always the goal: get to Washington. And so I spent my college career on the college newspaper. Emily can attest to this. When you are on the college newspaper in college, you spend a lot more time working on that than you do your classes. It becomes your entire life. And I wouldn't.
Most stressful job I've ever had in my life.
Oh, 100%. I mean, you've got these young people, these kids that really don't know what they're doing, responsible for putting out a newspaper for their campus, for their school, with very little oversight. And so I often think how fun it would be to go back and do that job now with all of the knowledge that I have now. I don't know how about you, Em, but like the things we would cover would be, a speech on campus, or I feel like, did you guys do any like investigative journalism at your college newspaper?
No, it was mostly speeches.
Right.
Although I was the opinion editor of my college newspaper, so I was mostly expressing my opinion, which made me one of the least popular people on campus. So
among students or among the professors and head of the college?
Among students. If I was critical of any student group or something like that, yeah, being an opinion columnist doesn't generally make you friends.
No. We should talk a little bit later about the difference between writing as an opinion columnist at a newspaper and actually covering the news, because that it's a necessary distinction. One of the first tastes I ever got of holding people accountable was my college got a new president. And maybe within his first 6 months, I decided to just poll how many people knew him. And so I dispatched a bunch of my friends with a picture of him about this big around campus, go up to random students. Can you identify this person? And we got a wide range of very hilarious answers, but very few knew that it was the president of the university that they attended. And so his name was Stuart. So we blasted on the cover, Stu who, ? With his face. Like nobody knows who he is. He referenced that story at my graduation as being the thing that made him realize that he needed to engage with the student body more. Now, I have no idea what he did in the years after, but that's the person that I had a direct responsibility in making this person change their behavior and change it for the better. And that's what journalism can do. You can make people powerful, hold them accountable, and make them realize that the way they're acting, their actions are not beneficial or helpful to the people they're supposed to be helping. And so I took from that experience the understanding that there's real power in this job, and a real responsibility too when you have that much power. Whether you're writing for a local newspaper, which I did my first year out of college, or one of the biggest national newspapers in the country, like the Washington Post. After college, like I said, I did a year at a local, very small town newspaper in my hometown, which was maybe one of the most fun journalism jobs I ever had. Again, Emily can contest because she covered news in her small town, that there's nothing like small town newspapers. There's nothing like covering the people that you grew up with and looking at your own town, your hometown, through the lens of a reporter. It's a fascinating experience. And then I got the dream. I got to move to Washington and work at Congressional Quarterly with Emily. It's a job that basically trains you how to cover our Congress. And the thing that I think is most amazing, and amazed me even as an American journalist, is that you got this press pass, and that press pass gave you free reign to the entire Capitol building, which meant that it didn't matter what senator it was, what other lawmaker, you could walk up to anyone. You could walk up to members of the president's cabinet if they happened to be there for the day. And you, with that press pass, gave you the power to walk up to them and ask them any question you wanted. You know, Hillary Clinton would be, or Barack Obama would be in congressional hearings. And after the hearing, there was nothing that stopped you from walking up and asking their opinion on something. And that is a freedom that we have in this country that is, I think, unmatched. The ability to have that kind of accountability for our elected officials, that they have to know that walking down the hall means they might bump into a journalist at any moment. And so Emily and I got our first exposure to that quite young, and spent many years up there together. I went from that to covering Washington, covering Congress for Pennsylvania, which is a state in America, the state that I'm from. I covered Washington for Pennsylvania. It's called regional reporting, and so they take people from all over the country and they bring them to DC to write about what the lawmakers are doing so that they can inform people back home. And then after that, I came to the Washington Post, and which has just been a dream. I've been here for 7 years, covering politics for most of it. Like Emily said, I spent 1 year doing a blog called Inspired Life, where I intended to find people who were living inspired lives and tell their stories. A lot of them were how they overcame adversity, told stories about race relations and immigration and illnesses. And And I really loved getting to the core of what moves people, what makes people persevere, what makes them resilient. And so I did that job for a bit, but I missed covering politics so much. It was the one thing, like I said, that I'd always wanted to do. And so I came back to covering politics in the middle of the Donald Trump administration, which was quite an adventure for those of us here in Washington. And here we are.
Thank you for that. That was quite a career. Now, the one thing you didn't mention was the time that we were both cast as extras in a Hollywood movie that was filming in Washington, D.C.
That's right. They were
a notice in the notice in some paper that
I think it was a hotel next door to the news. So Congressional Quarterly's newsroom, there was a hotel next door, and they were having casting at that hotel. And so a few girls, Emily and I and one or two others, went and got in line and wowed the casting directors with our charms.
Well,
and
specifically for Washington, D.C. reporter types.
Right.
And when we were way in the back of the line, Colby yelled, "Hello, we are Washington."
We are literally, yeah, I don't know if we actually made it into the movie, to be fair, but
one day on a Hollywood set, it was a cool experience for both of us. I think they cut our, and we were not in the movie. The movie, by the way, is State of Play, starring Ben Affleck and Russell Crowe. So
that's
got to be next to Ben Affleck for one scene. So that's our.
You were in the scene with me where we had to run up and down the stairs like multiple times. Do you remember that?
It was a very arduous day.
It was very hard. A lot goes into making a movie, apparently.
That was a brush with fame, but Colby, you've also interviewed some famous people for your job as well. Would you mind telling us about some of those? And then we'll go to questions because we have
Yeah, that's great. What I didn't expect is that, one, outside of politics, Hollywood, the celebrities in America love Washington. They love the idea of Washington. And so they come through DC all the time. And I've had the experience of interviewing any number of them. But I think the name that will resonate the most with the audience is that I did sit down for an interview with Donald Trump while he was running for president. It was the very beginning of his candidacy. It was at a time when nobody thought that he was going to win. They weren't taking him seriously. And I said, I'll interview him. So I went to one of his golf courses in Virginia, and he sat down, and he is incredibly charming in that he has got this skill that he knows how to make you feel like you actually matter. And I think it's maybe some of the allure that Republicans that come into his orbit feel. Republicans are the party that he's a member of. Colby, it's so good to see you. I was hoping you'd be here. I was so excited when they told me you'd be here. Like I've obviously never met this person before. And so in retrospect, I wish I knew then what we all know now about Donald Trump. But at that time, he was just a celebrity with it was a little, it was kind of offensive, but he was just kind of a joke. And I wrote a story, though, saying, like, he's serious, like he's going to run, and he's putting together a real operation to try to make a serious run for the White House to be president of the United States. And I like to remind people that I wrote that story in June 2015. And lo and behold, a couple of months later, it became clear that he was, in fact, seriously running for president and would become president of the United States. So, yeah, he's probably the most famous person that I've interviewed to date.
Great, there you have it. I can attest. I remember back when Colby did write the story, no one had taken Donald Trump seriously before, as she said, and then he became our president. So you have a good power of seeing the future, or to read people.
Well, I will say, there's nothing unique about my ability to see into the future. What I did was I went to a place where he was beginning to campaign, and I talked to people. It's in a state called Iowa, which is the first state to vote in our presidential elections. And everyone I spoke to was either voting for him or really interested in voting for him. And that was very surprising to me. And I thought, if this is not a coincidence that all of these people seem to be taking a serious liking to this man. And that's when I knew that if he wasn't going to win, he was going to at least be a very serious contender for the presidency. And the reason why I tell that story is because the most important thing you can do as a journalist is to talk to people and listen. Listening is honestly, if you can just sit back and take in what a person is saying to you, take in what's happening around you, that's the best form of reporting, in my opinion. I think it's the most effective and it's how you learn the most.
Thanks for that. It's a really good point. You know, I think sometimes for when we're talking to Algerians or people from any other country, it's so hard to explain how enormous America is. Yes. And how different each state is. So Colby is a reporter in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, but he or she kind of broke a big story by going into a different state, into a city, into kind of a small state that gets overlooked a bit, and just talking to people there. Right. And that became a huge story that changed everything in America. So a good lesson on, you can't just stay in the capital and report on laws that they're passing there. It's important to talk to people.
Absolutely.
So we have a bunch of questions coming in on
Great.
YouTube. Keep them coming in, guys. This question is from Tej Gomri. Tej is actually, he heads up the American space located in a city called Bashar. So Algeria is also enormous.
Yeah.
So he heads up an American center there.
Okay, great.
What's the hardest part? What's the hardest thing to learn to become a journalist?
That's a great question. I think there's two things that are really hard. One is to have the confidence to be able to approach people and ask them really difficult questions. That is not a comfortable thing to do. It is not comfortable to make somebody uncomfortable. And so oftentimes, the Donald Trump interview is a great example where I was a little bit off my game because I was so influenced by who he was, his kind of larger than life persona, that if he had been someone else, the questions I asked may have been harder. And so I think that's one aspect, that you have to have confidence in yourself, and that this is the job that you have been hired to do, a job, and that job is to hold people accountable, and that there's an entire public, an entire citizenry that has entrusted you with that responsibility. I think that's one that affects all journalists, I think, but one that's happened more recently with the internet is the backlash. Having what we call in America, the thick skin, the backbone, to be able to withstand the amount of criticism that comes both from the people you're covering and the people that support them. And so in the past, it used to be that a member of a politician's staff might call you and yell at you if they don't like what you've written. And, you've got to steel yourself for that. But now you have this entire internet through all types of social media. They can also tell you how terrible you are and how unfair you are and how biased you are. And we had a president for the last several years in Donald Trump who really fed that, who really encouraged his supporters to lash out at and criticize the media. And so the job has become one not for, I'm going to use another American cliche, but the faint of heart, meaning not for someone who will take those things personally. And it's hard not to. I've had threats made against me. I've had a threat made against my young daughter. They put security outside of my house once for several days. So that's not specifically how to become a journalist, but it's something you have to know if you're going to be a journalist, is that you're going to face a lot of backlash and criticism.
Thanks for that. segue into a question that was just asked on YouTube.
Yeah.
Abdul Maraga asks, is journalism considered a dangerous job, especially for women?
That's a great question. Yeah, so to my point, women especially have become the subject of a lot of harassment. We get called every name every bad and horrible name you can think of in the American language. Again, we get death threats. We get, direct messages and emails, and women really have faced this more than men in this field. So have my African American colleagues as well, though. If you're a Black reporter, if you're a Jewish reporter, like I am, they're going to find the thing that they think is your weakness, your vulnerability, and they're going to look to expose that. Have I ever really felt that my life was in danger? Certainly not in the way that it's like covering being a journalist in other parts of the world. It is actually dangerous. You can lose your life, you can go to jail, that doesn't happen in America largely. You cannot go to jail for what you write here. You cannot be persecuted at all for the things that you say. That is one of our core freedoms. But you can certainly face a lot of harassment. And it can really wear you down after a while. So dangerous, yes, there are parts of the job that are dangerous. Over the summer, there were big protests in America, all over the country. And the police were being very aggressive with the protesters. And journalists were out there, and some of them got hit with, whatever the police were throwing. They got hit with canisters or they got tear gassed. And so there are certain things you can cover that would make the job dangerous, but not dangerous the way it is in other parts of the world.
Thanks for that. I'd like to ask you a question from Tufik Belaid, who asks, how did you jump hurdles in your career as a female journalist?
Yeah,
and I think asking about what obstacles did you have to overcome that maybe were because you're a woman?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny, I never felt my gender until I got to a big national newspaper. And that's not a commentary on the Washington Post. It's just a commentary on what it's like to be part of this big national institution. And so some of those obstacles are the same as obstacles women face in any field, in any industry, which is being able to speak up for yourself, being able to express an opinion without seeming aggressive or being labeled as needy. Or this happens a lot in America and I'm sure other parts of the world where women are not given the same, women are judged differently than men in a meeting, or even in talking to sources in journalism. People will sometimes kind of talk down to you if you're a woman. There's a word, patronizing, which is when you really treat someone like they're a child or they're less than you when they talk to you. And that happens a lot. There's also men that will flirt with you. Unfortunately, our Hollywood media, often women are portrayed as these, sex symbols who use their sexuality to get stories or to flirt with sources. And that's certainly not the way we actually do it. That is not one of my tactics. But there was one instance where I did have to cut off a source for being completely inappropriate. And it was a source who was important to my coverage. And once I cut him out, he cut me off from events, and he'd give scoops to my competitors. But to me, it was more important for my dignity to not have this person in my life than to get a good story every once in a while. So those are things that I don't think men ever have to think about in both journalism and in industry in general.
Good point. All good points. I'm sorry all that happened to you. I would also add, I felt when I was a journalist that men would sometimes question my intelligence or insinuate that I was asking dumb questions.
Yeah.
Not a dumb question. That's a dumb question. Here's the question you should be asking.
Oh,
in a way,
I
see happening to my male colleagues. And I think that's a historical way that people tried to repress women, is to act like they're just not smart enough.
Right. Yeah.
It speaks to what you said earlier about how one of the most important things to be a journalist is confidence.
Yes, absolutely. And by telling you that you're not, it's a double-edged sword, because they'll tell you you're not smart enough, but then if you start talking a lot in a meeting or showing that you're smart, or then you're being too much of a show off, or you're trying to steal the attention. There's just it's really hard to strike a balance as a woman between being smart and confident and assertive and having men respect you for those qualities. And that's something that we come up against all the time.
Indeed. We have a question that Ahmed Henny has asked. What are the countries in which there are many female journalists?
Oh man, that is a really good question that I don't think I know the answer to.
As a journalist in America.
Yeah, I mean, we have done a really fabulous job in America. Fabulous is way too strong. We've done a great job in America of continuing to elevate women's voices in journalism. Where we haven't done a great job is giving women jobs as like the editor of these newspapers, to control the entire publication. And so that's where a lot of work needs to be done. Some issues with that is that once a woman becomes a mother, it becomes a lot harder to take some of those jobs that require you to be working all hours of the day and all night and weekends. And so that's another, I guess, challenge as a woman. There's an expectation that if you're a woman and a parent, that you have to make sacrifices in your career for your children in a way that men aren't expected to make those same sacrifices. And that's something we're also working on a lot here in America, something called, work-life balance, this idea that you should be able to have a successful career and also be a good parent. That doesn't answer your question about women in the world, and it actually makes me want to go and look that up. And I'm sure there are statistics that say what country has the most female reporters. I just don't have the answer. I know, Western Europe, the Western part of the world that has freedom of press, I would argue probably, but I just don't know. I would say that they probably have more female journalists in their newsrooms, but I could also be very wrong about that.
Thank you for the.
Another big part about journalism, the key thing, is to admit when you don't know something. That's something is a lot of sometimes, the temptation is to pretend like you know the answer. But what I've learned is that the best thing you can do is just admit when you don't know something and have the curiosity to learn it, and that will also make you a better journalist.
That is such a good point. I think that's one of the most important things in journalism, because say you're in a situation or even covering a meeting, you don't know what anyone's talking about, but everyone's acting like they do know, and you want to feel smart. So maybe you're going to pretend you know. But when you go back to write a story on that, you're going to realize you didn't know. So it's really just better, really, to just always say, oh, I didn't understand that. Can you explain?
Right. The thing I always say is pretend I know nothing about this. And then that kind of lets me off the hook a little bit. Talk to me about this as if this is my first time ever hearing about it. And then they can really kind of explain it to you in the simplest of terms.
Great tip. We have a question from Achuik Art, who wants to know, what would you recommend to those who are skilled in journalism but do not have degrees? So maybe you could talk about, and just to let you know, in Algeria, it's very common for people in college to major in math and science. Is probably more popular for people to major in. A lot of people who do that, they'll go on to be writers or to do something else. Math and science is probably a more popular career path. So does somebody have to have a degree in journalism to be a journalist?
You don't. I mean, the most important thing you can do is write, write whenever you can. Keep a blog, offer articles to your local news organizations, because at the end of what I did in college means so much less than the experience that I've gained over my last 15 years as a reporter. And I found that having a really impressive degree sometimes opens that first door. It gets you in that for that first step. But after that, everyone's equal. I mean, Emily will tell you, can attest that we're in our first job. A lot of the people we worked with went to the most prestigious, the most impressive universities in America. Emily and I went to good colleges, but not those top tier ones. And once we were there, it didn't matter. Like, we were all doing the same job. We were all skilled. We were all talented. So just practice the craft of writing. If that's what you love, if you love writing, if you love journalism, the best advice I have is just to do it. Find ways to do it. And don't worry about whatever your academic past is. There are plenty of people that find their way into journalism. Plenty of people that I know that have found their way into journalism that didn't major in journalism or English or writing. I'm like automatically thinking of like 5 people right now off the top of my head who got it. There's so many paths. You don't have to have known you wanted to be a journalist since you were 8, like I did. Like, I think that's probably more rare, actually. I think what is more likely is that you'll find your way to it in other ways. So, just keep writing.
Right. Writing, Itkowitz art, and publish that writing somewhere. There's just so many ways you can publish things now. You can have a podcast, you can have a blog, you can print something out and pass it out old school style. If you're trying to maybe get hired for a newspaper job down the road, they'll want to see that you actually wrote something, and you wrote smart reportage on your blog. You can direct people to that. So get the writing out there.
Yeah.
We'll just take a couple more questions maybe, but Colby, I kind of wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you're not arrested for being a journalist in the US. Mm-hmm. That generally can't happen because of our First Amendment protection. Right. Our First Amendment of our US Constitution protects you from that. But have you ever has anyone ever tried to convince you to not write something? Did you ever write something where someone really didn't like it and they tried to maybe threaten you or just convince you not to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to remember if I've ever was threatened. Definitely, I don't think I personally was ever threatened. I know a ton of colleagues that have been threatened. But certainly you will have people try to talk you out of something. And as a woman, I think, Emily, you brought this up earlier, rather than threaten you, they'll try and tell you that it's a bad idea. It's a dumb idea. If you do this, you're going to look really stupid. Like, don't go down that path. Like, you're going to get that completely wrong. And they try to intimidate you that way because they can't intimidate you by threatening you with any kind of legal, right? It's very, very hard. Newspapers get sued for, but it's very, very hard to actually win a lawsuit against a newspaper based on what was written. We are held to certain ethics and morals, but they're not laws. So if someone tells you something, what we call off the record is when someone tells you something, but they don't want you to print it. They don't want you to use their name. If I went ahead and printed it anyway, that would be very, very bad journalism ethics and would not look very good for me as a professional, but nothing could happen to me. They couldn't throw me in jail for that. And so, yes, they'll find other ways to try and intimidate you.
We just got a question from Farida Mekki, and she wants to know, does the government check your reports before you publish it?
Oh, absolutely not. No, we are a completely independent press in America, which is one of the most amazing things about journalism in America, is that there is nothing that the White House, that anyone in government can do to stop a story from coming out. They can try, and they certainly have on big stories about national surveillance of Americans, stories that expose why we went to war that journalists have written. But even when they do everything in their power to try and stop it, they can't stop it. And that is why reporting in America and in anywhere where there's a free press is so important. And it's so important to maintain the integrity of the freedom of the press, because you are the only thing, we are the only thing that is keeping government from behaving as corruptly and as badly as they otherwise could. And sure, there is still plenty of corruption that happens that we don't see and that maybe we never get, but we have these things called whistleblowers in America. And a whistleblower is someone who will tell a journalist a government secret and kind of tip them off. They'll do it anonymously, meaning they won't say who they are, and will send a journalist kind of down the road of an investigation that exposes something bad that the government is doing. And there's whistleblower protection laws that try to protect people who do that. So even the people that are giving up information on the government, the only way that a whistleblower can get in trouble is if it's if they can argue that it was harmful to our national security. And so then a whistleblower, I don't know if the name Edward Snowden means anything to the group, but he was a whistleblower that worked for the government that gave up government secrets about how the American government was surveilling Americans after 9/11. And the Washington Post broke that story and won many awards for it. But he's still in exile because he would get arrested if he was here in America, because they would argue it was a threat to national security and treasonous and whatnot.
Yes, but make those cases. So
What do you
journalists
say?
actually, I was just making the point, it's very hard to make those cases to really arrest a journalist and to.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and that's not arresting the journalist. The Washington Post reporters who wrote the story about the government surveillance, who informed the world, none of those reporters those reporters couldn't be in trouble. They couldn't arrest those journalists for writing those stories. So yeah, it's very, very hard for a journalist to get in trouble for anything they write.
Great. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Although maybe I want to end on a bit more of a positive note.
Okay.
I know you've already given your tips for people who maybe want to be a journalist, but maybe you can tell us, what it is you like about being a journalist so much.
Yeah. I love that no 2 days are the same. I love that you wake up in the morning. Sure, there's people that are working on projects, but you wake up in the morning and you have no idea where that day is going to take you. You have no idea what news might break that day, what a government official might tell you that tips you off onto something. And it's this unraveling every day of using your mind and your communication skills to decipher information and then figure out the best way to impart that to a general American audience. And so figuring out, how do you write it? How do you explain it? If I was reading this and knew nothing about it, how would I want someone to tell it to me? A great tip is, if you're thinking about how to write on something, especially if it's complicated, and it's really important to explain complicated things in your writing, because you want your reader to understand. Write the story like you're telling it to your mom, to your best friend, to your sister or brother. How would you explain the situation to them? And write it that way. Some people will draft a story in an email, so it feels more conversational. And then you can make it more professional. But that's a great way to provide the context and background and information that your reader is going to need to understand something. And I think that that's just such a fun puzzle that you have to work with every day. But yeah, it's the excitement of not knowing what every day is going to bring is my favorite part of being a reporter.
Well, thank you so much for that, Colby. It was a pleasure to speak to you and a pleasure to have you as a guest on Let's Chat. I think our viewers enjoyed it as well. For everyone watching on YouTube, please do follow us on YouTube so you don't miss chats like this. Next week, we're talking about why Americans celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And then after that, we'll get back to some more Women's History Month stuff, but please do tune into that chat next week at 6 p.m. Thanks for watching, and thank you so much, Colby.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.